So just pointing out again in relation to REM sleep, which is kind of a clear finding, as you can see here, when looking at the activity in the brain during REM sleep as compared to wakefulness, or REM sleep as compared to slow wave sleep. Basically, what you see here is the blue areas here designating less activity, the yellow-red areas here designating more activity in the REM phase. And what you basically see is that there's less activity in the frontal areas than compared to wakefulness, but much more activity in the visual areas, and especially in the associative, the secondary visual areas. So definitely subjects are not seeing anything as such because there's no light coming in, so there's no activity in the primary visual areas, but there's lots of activity in the secondary visual areas. And you could imagine that this sort of reflects that they are having visual dreams, and they're at least internally seeing a lot of things without actually receiving any input through the eyes. As compared to the slow wave sleep, what you see quite clearly here is that there's quite a lot of activity in the frontal motor areas, which reflects this motor activity that is commonly seen in the REM sleep, but which is prevented from having any physical effect by this inhibition of the spinal motor neurons, so that the only thing that you really see is these rapid eye movements. So those are the only muscles which are being activated in this state. So just to continue a little bit on what is actually the use of us sleeping, and this is still something that's being debated over and over again, and it's still basically two different ideas. One is that sleep is necessary in order to restore things, that you've been active and that you need to sort of have a period of time where everything is cooled down a little bit, and where things can catch up again. The other possibility is that it's kind of an adaptive phase where you have the possibility of consolidating some of the experiences that you've had during the day. And there seems to be more and more evidence which supports that possibility. So this is from a review paper from a couple of years ago, just showing the improvement in various different tasks. So this is a visual texture discrimination task. This is a motor sequence learning task. Here, a motor adaptation learning task. What is common in all of these cases is that if you look at the green ones here, this is measurements on the same day that the task was being learned, was being performed originally. And you see not very much improvement, but as soon as you let subjects sleep overnight and you test them on the next day, they're actually much better. And you see the same thing here. So you have the training here in the morning, later on, they are a bit better there. But if you let them sleep and you test them again the very next day, they're quite a lot better here. And you see the same thing here, the same thing here. You also see it in this task, wakefulness, and when they have slept. And it turns out that there is actually quite a good correlation with subjects, how much time they've been spending in slow wave sleep and in REM sleep, and the improvement. So the more time that they've been spending in these different sleep stages, the more improvement you see in these different tasks. So could it be that what sleep is actually doing is to consolidate some of the learning that we've been doing during the day? And there seems to be some evidence for it. So when you look at the expression of genes in the brain and look at what are the differences between sleeping and being awake, you find that most of them are expressed to the same extent, but there are a few which are different. So one of the main differences is that some of the early genes involved in motor learning or in learning in general, which are important in sort of promoting learning, they're being downregulated during sleep, which is obvious because you're not really learning any much new while you're sleeping. But on the other hand, some of the late genes, which are involved in consolidating memory and changing the brain structurally in order for you to be able to remember what you have learned very long time ago, are actually being upregulated. So there is some evidence that could go along with this. This is just to show just another task that it's also more cognitive tasks where you have to solve this, I think it's called Hanoi Tower, where you have to move these rings to this pin, and you have to do that in a specific sequence in order to do it as quickly as possible. And again, if you get to sleep during the night, you tend to be much better at it the next morning. So this is just showing the activity in parts of the brain in rats which have been either living in a controlled environment or an enriched environment, and looking at the activity of specific genes involved in consolidation of memory. And what you see is that this is wakefulness, slow wave sleep, and REM sleep. And what you see here is that for the rats living in the enriched environment, you see much, much more expression of this gene during the REM sleep, possibly reflecting that quite a lot of this activity that you have here, what they have been learning, experiencing in this enriched environment, is now being consolidated. Difficult to know, but at least it's evidence that would go along with this. And this is a little bit along the same line of evidence. It's a hugely complex study, and certainly it can be interpreted in various ways. Basically, what they did was to have two groups of subjects. One group of subjects training a specific task several times during the day. The other group just acted as a control, so they didn't train this task very much. They just did it once, and that was it. Then they had the subject sleeping, and then they recorded the activity in the brain when the subjects were sleeping, and compared that activity to the activity that you would see when the subjects were performing this task during the daytime. So what they found was that for the subjects who were training the task, I can't remember exactly which one it is, but I would have to look at that. You can look it up yourself afterwards. For the subjects who had been training the task, there was much more similarity in the activity of the brain during the REM sleep as compared to the other group which hadn't been training the task. So it was as if the training of the task would sort of make the subjects have more of the same activity while they were dreaming. So you get the idea that maybe what they're doing is kind of rehearsing what they've been learning during the day in order to consolidate that memory. At least that's what the authors were implying from this study. Difficult to know again, but at least that is the evidence. So another thing which points in this direction is what I think is a really, really nice study, which was done a couple of years ago. Again, a relatively complicated design, but when you go through it, it's actually quite easy to follow. So basically, they had subjects training a specific task here. So this is just doing the task on different trials, and they become a little bit better at doing it. Then they get a rest, and actually getting the rest makes them do it even better. they do it a couple of times, they get another rest here, they do it again, they've reached sort of a plateau here, and then they get a night's sleep, and hooray, the next morning they're much better at doing it again, as you've seen before. So now what they then do, and already here there are things which are interesting, because you notice that following this break, there was no improvement in the task. But notice what happens here. So they have training, then they have a pause here, they become a little bit better, and then during this pause, they take a nap. So they sleep for an hour and a half, and they actually become better, which they didn't here. Again, following a night's sleep, they become better here. So just sleeping at this time of the day actually helps them to consolidate the memory even better. But now look at what happens here. Because again, they train, they take a pause, they become better, and then they do another task here. So instead of just taking a break, they train another motor task. And this is now good. This is bad because you can see their performance goes down on that task. And when they sleep during the night, there's no improvement. So if you compare this to this, these are now a hell of a lot worse than those subjects up there. So doing another task at that point is really, really bad. But now look at what they did. And this is what I think is really the neat thing. They had the subjects training, and then they let them, again, have a pause, and then they let them, let me see, here they had them sleeping this time. So they slept for an hour, 90 minutes during this period, and then they did the other task. And now look, at this time, the performance of that task didn't make them worse, and when they slept during the night, they had the improvement in the task again, so that they were almost as good as these, even though they had been performing the other task. So taking a nap can actually protect you from the negative interference from learning another task. You sort of consolidate your memory a little bit more efficiently when you go to sleep, so that the interference from other experiences, other learning, is not as severe. This is neat, because it also has some practical implications. It basically means that you should go to sleep now. Thank you. So, sleep-inducing drugs, just quickly. There's not much known about it, but there have been some experiments done mainly in dogs, where you had sort of a dog which has been sleep depraved for quite some time, and then people have been taking out fluid from the brain or from wherever, blood, and injecting it into other dogs to see if they would fall asleep. Based partly on that sort of research, a number of sleep-inducing drugs have been found. So these are all in some ways capable of inducing sleep when injected into animals. Muramyl and interleukin-1 are not really as such substances that you would normally find in the brain, and which would normally be thought to promote sleep in the brain. So it's probably some kind of pathological finding to some extent. On the other hand, adenosine and melatonin are both found in the brain and are being involved in neural transmission, involved in regulating wakefulness. So both of these are definitely part of the system which promotes sleep in the brain. Well, I don't think I wanted to say anything about that. You know what jet lag is. Let's take a break.